This is Distant Replay, the podcast that goes back in time to relive all the greatest events that we witnessed in sports. From upsets, to championships, to cultural moments, we discuss it all. Coming up on today's episode.
Scottie Pippen signed a deal in 1991 for 7 years for $18 million. And if he played it right, he could have made 9 times that amount, 10 times.
I said to Scottie the same thing I'd said to Michael. If I were you, I wouldn't sign this contract. You may be selling yourself too short. It's too long a contract that you're locking yourself in for.
I felt like I couldn't afford to gamble myself, getting injured and not being able to provide. I needed to make sure that people in my corner were taken care of.
Well, we're taking a look at the second episode of the Last Dance documentary. We did part 1 already. They had episodes 1 and 2 debuted Sunday, April 19th. Everybody was watching. It's the only sports on right now, and it's not really sport, but we were so hungry for anything that everybody is watching this documentary. Not that they wouldn't have already, because it's MJ. This is a behind-the-scenes look, a really in-depth look at really his career, but also that final season at Chicago. And episode 2 is all about, well, for the most part, Scottie Pippen. And I guess we're going to introduce a lot of these different characters from this season, at least the main power players. Pippen's one of those, obviously the number 2 on this team to Jordan. And there's no question what the story is. It's about Pippen. It's about his salary, about not being happy with Jerry Krause, happy with his position on the team. And there's a lot to talk about with this episode tonight. So we'll do that. He also goes through a little bit of Jordan's second season. We'll talk that, and also some of Jordan's family background and that dynamic with his brothers and his dad. But this is Distant Replay Podcast. You can find us online at distantreplaypodcast.com, on Twitter at Distant Podcast, also on YouTube as well. You'll go back and you can see all of our old episodes as we go back and watch games and relive them in the moment. This is a little different. We're doing a little special series on the Last Dance documentary because everybody's talking about it. We're very interested in it, and we already had our first episode on this. Now it's episode 2, Mike, and it's all about Pippen, man. I mean, we knew, and I kind of knew, you probably remember a little bit more of this than I did. I think you were a little more in tune with this team and just the NBA than I was at this point. But everybody got to look at who Pippen was, how good Pippen was, and how undervalued Pippen was by the Bulls.
Yeah, and you knew Pippen was undervalued by the Bulls. That was before I even was fully aware of what his contract terms were.
Yeah.
And how those compared to the rest of the league, which you found out in this episode. Because, you know, I mean, in the 98 season, I was like, 16, 17 years old. So while you're a fan of the sport, you're not really that in tune with the finer things of contracts and contract negotiation and things of that nature. But he played second fiddle to Michael Jordan in a lot more ways than just on the court. We start off this episode with Pippen at the ring ceremony before the first game of the 97-98 season. And it sounded like he was basically giving a farewell speech to the fans. I mean, he got choked up because he was that sure that he wasn't going to be back the next season, and he wanted to, basically thank the fans. This is before the season even, really starts.
Yeah, you kind of felt that way, and I think the reporter asked Jordan about that. What did you think about his comments? And he said, Scotty's emotional. It is, he has the right to feel that way. But yeah, I mean, you kind of had that sense that Scotty knew in the back of his head that, and probably because of the injury, he knew like, hey, I might not ever play for this team again. There's a pretty good chance because I've still got to rehab my injury. I don't know how long that's going to take, and everything was kind of boiling up. I think he kind of knew. Nobody else really did at that point just how pissed off he was about everything, and he was about to unleash that, and he kind of gave a hint of that in that episode. But you hit salary, so let's talk salary for a minute. And that was a big conversation about the show, especially on social media, because he was, and they went through all the stats. Like he was, one of the top players in the NBA, maybe top 5 in the game at that time. But he was the 6th highest player on his team. And let's run down the salaries real quick, Mike, okay, for that season. MJ made a little over $33 million. Ron Harper and Tony Kukoc both made $4.5 million. Dennis Rodman just behind them, around $4.5. And then Luke Longley made $3.2 million. Scottie was making $2.775 in that 97-98 season.
Crazy. So to give a little bit of a background, right? He signed a 7-year, $18 million contract before the 1991 season. So this was going to be the last season for him under this current contract. And like you said, just wildly underpaid. The league sort of changed a lot, where it got a lot more popular during the course of his contract, and the salaries were much higher. And Jordan literally getting paid 10 times as much as Scottie Pippen.
It's wild. And, I've since, the last, 12 hours since this episode is aired, but apparently a lot of that contract was front loaded too. So as this contract went along, it got worse as we went. So the value looked even worse in 97, 98 as it did when he first signed it. Did you know who his agent was?
I don't, but supposedly what happened was his rookie contract was terrible, right? And the Bulls ripped up his rookie contract a little earlier to give him the security of the 7 years, $18 million. And that ended up being an even worse contract. But who was his agent?
Jimmy Sexton.
Really?
And Jimmy Sexton represents now, he's one of the power players, especially at the college level. Nick Saban, 11 of the 14 SEC head coaches, Julio Jones, Shaka Smart. The list goes on and on. He's one of the top agents right now. And I look at this a couple different ways, because to me, and I get it, like there comes a time in your life for a lot of these athletes, right? There's a lot of different decisions that have to be made. And you make them based on a couple of factors. One, what do you need right now for you, for your family? What is most important for you and your family right now in terms of money? Versus if I wait, if I delay, if I put this off, I can make X amount more. Is that more important to maximize, or is it more important to make sure my family's secure? It happens all the time with players that, I think about college football players that leave early that might have had the chance to be first-round draft picks and make significantly more with the way the NFL contracts are structured, but go out a little bit earlier, become second or third-round picks because they need to get into the league and make the money, right? They make that choice, and they try to prove it and earn it. I think for Scottie, it was the same way. The way he even said it himself, that he made the decision based on his family. His dad was in a wheelchair. His brother was in a wheelchair, which were both awful stories that he had to deal with growing up. Really tragic kind of upbringing. But he came from this kind of poor background in Arkansas. $18 million is life-changing money to him and his family. And he made that decision. So part of me is like, hey, you make that decision and you live with it, because Reinsdorf said he told him not to take it. I don't know that I believe Reinsdorf would talk him out of a contract like that. Who knows what Sexton was telling him? I'm sure Sexton was trying to maximize his contract, because Sexton's an agent. He's getting paid off of that money. He had to have known that $18 million was not a great value for him, especially by the time they got 4 or 5 years into that contract. So part of me is like, yeah, it sucks. He was getting screwed by the Bulls, but the other half of me is like, hey man, you made this decision. This is what you wanted for that protection, and this is just part of that deal.
Yeah, I think it was a situation where as he got deeper into the contract and his profile grew a lot, he probably not forgot, but sort of lost track of why he signed the deal in the first place, right? This is a guy who was 6'1". He grew 6 inches while he was in college. So he's a late bloomer, finds himself on the Bulls in this great situation, and he probably looked at it like, man, I can secure $18 million right now, and set my family up forever. And I think you're right. I think his perspective at the time he signed the contract and his thinking about taking it was probably sound. And he even went into it during the documentary that, he didn't know, what the future held in terms of how he's going to grow as a player, how his injury history was going to be. So he took the money when he could, and as a result became really bitter about it.
I don't know that NBA franchises restructured contracts too much back then. I guess that wasn't the case, but yeah, that was kind of the other part of it, is like, I think a lot of people were like, why didn't they actually make it good and restructure his contract and try to make him happy and keep him around? But that's what kind of led, and that's a big part of this 97-98 season. And we kind of see that for the first time here, as we kind of got a preview of that in his comments he made, but we find out that he suffers an injury that should have been taken care of immediately after the previous NBA Finals in June. But he decided, and I loved it, he said, I'm not going to ruin my summer for the Bulls right now. And can you imagine somebody saying that now, like the grief they would get just by the public? And nobody's going to fault Pippen now, in retrospect. But if he said that in the moment, that you're not going to ruin my summer, I'll rehab on the clock essentially, and you can pay me to rehab since I'm not getting paid during the summer by you guys, and we'll deal with it then. But God, I mean, that is a ballsy move, and that just shows you how poor that relationship was.
Yeah, and everyone knew in the moment that was involved with the team knew what he was doing when he did that. When he chose not to get the surgery. And you saw that lead to Jordan being absolutely have way more of an edge with his teammates at the beginning of the season when Pippen was out. I mean, you get a little bit of a sneak preview into what it was like practicing with Jordan day in and day out. But him ratcheting up the intensity because he knew in terms of a leadership standpoint and an on-the-court standpoint that he had more of a load to bear with Scottie not playing and him just going in on his teammates, man. That, I mean, you always hear these stories, but to see it sort of, see it right in front of your eyes is something to see.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see more of that too as this show goes on. I think we'll see a look into this because Pippen is not back on the court. He's still rehabbing as this episode's moving along. But, that's a big part of it because, the Bulls are – this is it. I mean, this is the last dance, as they say. And, we find out the name of this is because, Phil Jackson says the beginning of every season has a theme for every season. And this one was, I think, a quote or a headline he pulled from a newspaper about this being potentially the last dance for the Bulls. And he presented that to him before the season and laid it out for him. And that's kind of where we have our name. But, because of that, I think Jordan and everybody else kind of feels this pressure of we gotta really respond out of the gates. And this team struggled early on, and we get a look at that in that the beginning of that 97 season, that this team was not competitive about it all. I mean, they got blown out by the Cavs on the road. Started 0-4 on the road. Yeah,
and you have all this stuff sort of, again, this is another one of these scene-setting episodes. You have all this stuff boiling up. You have the Pippen disagreements with the front office, the overall unrest between the players and the front office, the coach in the front office. You have Jerry Krause openly trying to trade Pippen, even though he has this favorable contract that we just spent time talking about. What sense that makes, I don't know. And you have just this boiling over of emotions that early in this season, you forget about it now because the NBA season's so long and they eventually right the ship. But you get to the point where you have Pippen cursing out Krause on the bus in front of the whole organization.
Did that story get out when it happened?
I don't think it did. And you had Phil Jack. I think a lot of stuff back then got handled in house. Yeah. You know what I mean? And a lot of the beat reporters, I think, were they wanted to get access to all these guys. They couldn't leak stuff like that. Well,
didn't we even see that one guy in this episode, or maybe the first episode, that I don't know if you caught it in the locker room or somewhere in the tunnel coming out, and he said, "Hey, I hope you like my story." Did you catch that? Like, hey, I hope you approve of what I wrote about you, Mike, on his way out the door one time. So I think it's kind of that sense of, yeah, I mean, we want access, and we're not gonna pull back the curtain completely on what's happening here in the moment. So yeah, I mean, that's such a huge story, and the fact that everybody was aware, and it had to be so awkward to be on that bus.
Yeah, and there's no, I remember back then, there's no blogs, there's not as much of a national media presence.
You can't
so
go
if you
live
wanted to keep things quiet, you could. And I mean, the stuff with, you got to the point where Phil Jackson had to pull Scottie aside and be like, "Hey, you need to get a hold of yourself here." Scott, the bitterness of Scottie in that contract, almost, sort of swallowed up this team and their quest to win. And it eventually leads to Pippen asking for a trade.
Yeah, and just to kind of quickly touch on your trade comments, I mean, it was crazy how Krause was just so blatantly open about, yeah, I mean, we're entertaining offers for him right now. We got a few that we thought were pretty good, and anybody's tradable. Not a, hey, sure, I mean, people would love to have Scottie Pippen on his team. Who wouldn't love to have Scottie Pippen on their team? There's always going to be trade offers for Scottie, but we're not interested. We're looking forward to this season. None of that. I mean, it was just blatantly, he played one side and Pippen played the other. And you could even see they had the one moment in the locker room where Krause was in there trying to talk to Pippen. I don't know what he was talking about. I don't know if he was lecturing him or just talking about the game. Pippen didn't make a single second of eye contact. He was getting dressed in his locker, and that was it.
Yeah, and you know, this is, again, we talked about Reinsdorf, our last podcast here for episode 1. But this is somewhere where Reinsdorf maybe wants to step in and tell Krause, hey, look, Jerry, you won. Phil's not going to be back next year. Jordan's not going to be back next year. And Pippen's a free agent, so he's probably not going to be back next year either.
Yeah.
Just let the season play out and just, you know, sort of go in the backdrop here for the rest of the year. You don't have to talk to the media. And if you do, you don't have to, you know, tell them everything that's on your mind.
Yeah, it's just crazy how. I mean, I get siding with Pippen. Like, I go back and forth on how I feel by, yeah, Pippen, you should have known. I mean, this is kind of on you. You have to kind of own this. But at the same time, it seems like Krause is just kind of like twisting that knife every opportunity he's got. And, you know, if you're making less than Luke Longley on that team, I can see why you're so upset. The other part of this I really was fascinated with was Jordan's injury. So we go back to his second season. We already saw his first in the first episode. Second season, this team's starting to kind of come around, got a chance for the playoffs. Jordan suffers this broken bone in his foot. They have to limit his play. So, you know, he's got a rehab, and I love the fact that he went back to North Carolina to rehab. The team was like, yeah, go ahead. Can you imagine, first off, a team letting an injury rehab process take place outside of their watch, number one, which was crazy. Jordan goes back to UNC. He's doing his thing, and he just starts playing. And I love the fact that he's like, I started playing 1-on-1, felt good, went 2-on-2, 3-on-3. Next thing you know, I'm running 5-on-5, and the Chicago Bulls have no idea this is happening.
This is the preeminent athlete of a generation where the Bulls do not have an idea of what kind of regimen he's under as far as rehabbing. And like you said, they let him go to North Carolina to rehab. I don't know how him or his agent talked this whole scenario into happening. And like you said, they tell the story about when he got back to the facility that, you know, his legs and stuff, you know, looked healthy and looked like he had been working out. Yeah. And how Reinsdorf and Krause were shocked by this. They had no clue.
I can't fathom it today because of the sports medicine and the rehab that each program, even down to like high school levels, have now, to where they have different regimens that you got to go through, and they monitor every single process. I mean, even right now as we speak, when athletes are quarantined, Nick Saban's using Apple Watches to track his team and what their workouts are like. I mean, that's how tightly watched these guys are now. And Jordan's over here just going back to Chapel Hill. I don't know if he told him he was going back to finish school or what. But the fact that he was able to go there and stay there for a long amount of time and practice, play, and just do whatever he wanted to, essentially, just still blows my mind. And when he gets back, I mean, the Bulls are like, look, you are everything to this franchise. We cannot risk you getting injured, and you're not going to play. There's a small chance that if you get injured again, your career's done. Jordan, as a competitor, said, I don't really care. There's a 10% chance I get injured, my career's over. There's a 90% chance we're fine and we're playing. And it was wild, though, that they limited his minutes. 7 minutes, which is a random number to me, 7 minutes per half.
Yeah, I'd love to know how they came up with the 7 minutes per half. So 14 minutes per game, 7 minutes per half. And Jordan being focused on the 90%, hey, nothing's going to go wrong number is so Jordan.
Yeah.
Right? And when Reinsdorf told the story about, he broke it down to Jordan, like, if you have 10 pills – and 9 of them, if you take 9 of them, they won't kill you, but 1 will. Would you take the pills? And Jordan's like, absolutely, I'd take the pills. That was just a great line.
Depends on how bad
by
the
him.
Headache is, yeah.
And you'd expect nothing less, you know?
Yeah, and so they're limiting his minutes, and now it's obviously hampering the potential for a playoff run because Jordan's only playing 14 minutes a game, which is, and like even down to the second. Like, as soon as that clock hits 7 minutes, get him out of the game now. And it felt like that's all that the front office cared about. Like, that's all they're monitoring every game is are you going 7 minutes and 5 seconds with this player? If so, we're gonna have a conversation with you in our office when you're done, head coach. You know what I mean? Like, that's all we care about right now. I don't care if you're winning or losing on the court. That's all we care about. And again, that's what rubbed Jordan the wrong way is we've got an opportunity to make the playoffs right now, and you're worried about me playing more than 14 minutes a game, and I feel fine. And you don't know it, but I've been playing probably hours down in North Carolina and held up fine. But it's funny because they get to that last game where they have to get a win, and Jordan, there's literally 15 seconds left, and they pull Jordan out of the game because his clock's over with. He's reached his max for that game, and that's wild to me. Like, even in that moment, you can't make that exception to play the extra 20, 30 seconds of the game in the crucial minute. And how are you mismanaging the clock to where you don't have your guy in the game the final 30 seconds? Like, if you're going to have him in the game that late, how do you not have it worked out to where you're going to get to the very end?
Because probably the coach saying, well, I know we might go 30 seconds over the minutes restriction here, but we're playing for a playoff spot. And it's not like the general manager who looks like a cartoon character is going to waddle down and tell me to take him out of the game, which is what happened, which is absolutely bonkers. That they're late in the season. They need to win the game to stay in the playoff hunt. And you have Jerry Krause with 30 seconds left telling the coach he has to take him out of the game. So insane when you think about it. And I think this is the moment, and this time period with this minutes restriction is what started his tenuous relationship with the upper management. I think
absolutely.
That's why they included this in the documentary, because this is where it all started. So by the time we get to 97, we're talking 13 years of this.
And that's exactly right. We've been going through this for more than a decade. I mean, his entire career essentially has been dealing with this and having that, really just being bitter over how that process was handled. And, because of that, we almost didn't get Jordan in the playoffs in the second year. And Paxson hits a game-winning shot. And I guess that game sent him to the playoffs. I don't think they ever made that clear. I think they were kind of using that game as an example of, hey, this is a pivotal game late in the season. I don't know if this game was the one that sent him in the playoffs, but Paxson hits the shot. They make it the playoffs. And because of that, we see one of the great performances in NBA history with Jordan's game at the Garden against that Boston Celtics team, which was legendary. And he goes off for 63 points with this Bulls team that was doing coke and hanging out with basically strippers in a hotel room, happy going, 30 and 50 every year.
Yeah, and you bring up 30 wins. The Bulls were an 8 seed in these playoffs with a record of 30 and 52, which is crazy. You'll never see that.
I don't
know if
that.
that's happened since.
Wild.
Yeah, they showed the stat. They showed the standings in the documentary. I don't know if that's happened since, that a team with 30 wins made the playoffs. Because you got to remember, they didn't have as many teams back then. But then you have Jordan going to play the 1986 Celtics, who many people consider to be the best NBA team ever. Okay, and you have Jordan going for 49 in game one, going out the next day and playing golf with Danny Ainge on the off day, and telling Danny Ainge, he's going to have something more for him the next day. And then the next day, game two, he scores 63. Unbelievable.
What a run.
Against the Bird Celtics.
Yeah.
With Bird, McHale, Parrish, a healthy Bill Walton.
Dennis Johnson.
Danny
Ainge. Yeah. That team was stacked.
Of course, they didn't match up team-wise, you know what I mean? So I believe they got swept. But this was sort of Jordan's now next level of the coming out party.
Yeah.
Hey, he's a rookie. He's doing a bunch of exciting things. Great. But now we have, in the playoffs at the Boston Garden, he's performing like this as well.
Yeah, about to be a changing of the guard. I think you can kind of see that in that moment. The other part of this episode, number 2, is we got to look at Jordan's kind of family background, his upbringing, in Wilmington, North Carolina, playing at Laney High School and kind of his development there. And really that relationship with his dad and his brothers. And his dad, obviously that was a big part of his life when his dad was killed. That made him want to step away from the game, and really kind of changed his trajectory of his career. But you kind of got that sense like that was a no-nonsense family, number one. You had to compete for everything. It seemed like, it was a great family nucleus, but, there's no coddling in this family. And his dad even said, I would be hanging out with Jordan, and his brother Larry was obviously kind of the better athlete at the time and kind of the guy that could do everything compared to Jordan, who was still trying to figure it out, younger kid, trying to make his way. And his dad was even just like, if there was one time when, he was out and Jordan, he's like, I could have asked him for a Phillips head screwdriver who'd have brought me a pair of pliers. He told him just to go inside and go hang out with your mom or whatever. Can you imagine telling Michael Jordan that growing up? And this kind of changed his whole mindset. I've got to prove myself every single moment of my life.
Yeah, and it sort of brings some context to when you hear people talk about Jordan, where they say, man, this guy was competitive in everything. He was competitive on the court. He was competitive if we were playing ping pong, if we were playing cards. He was competitive of everything. And this is where you see sort of that foundation laid, is when they talk about his early life. Even when they were talking to his mother in the documentary, when they were sort of making fun of how Jordan, she saved the letter that Jordan wrote her.
Yeah.
To send him, money, and he was sorry about the phone bill, and all this stuff that, you sort of equate with college kids. His mother's still digging him about that all these years later. Like you said, just a no nonsense sort of salt of the earth, great family that sort of laid the foundation for how competitive he ended up being.
Yeah, so we got to look at that as well, and just pretty cool to see that story, but. This episode was all about Pippen and all about Jordan's really kind of turning the corner and breaking out as a game superstar, an NBA superstar, possibly could be on his rise to one of the greats. And we saw that in this episode too. So anything else, Mike, that you want to hit on that we missed?
Just some quick hits here. David Stern calling Scottie Pippen Scott Pippen.
Yeah,
when he announced him at the draft.
So
that
these
might
guys,
be the last time anyone's ever said that.
These guys were Scott and Mike when they basically transitioned when they were starting off early in their career. Mike Jordan, Scott Pippen.
Yeah, exactly. So great. The last time I think both of them were called Mike and Scott, at least by the media. And getting back to Jerry Krause, who was a main focal point of not only this episode but the first episode as well, is they get into some of the good moves he made. Whether it was drafting Pippen, that he also drafted Horace Grant, and also the trade that sent Charles Oakley to the Knicks for Bill Cartwright to sort of get them the center that they needed.
Right.
Those are moves that Krause made that I'm glad, since he's not here to defend himself in all this, they actually mentioned some of the good stuff he did. Now, as we see, the way he handled himself throughout the years sort of outweighs those good moves he made. But he did know how to fit the pieces around Jordan, and I don't think that can be denied.
Yeah, he did have the best interest of the team in mind, even though it didn't seem like it at times later on. But he did a lot to kind of set that team up for where they were. I mean, trading Oakley is a big deal. That guy turned out to be a stud. And, for your Knicks especially, how good he was. But he did make some moves and put the pieces in place and make it work for that team. But all about Pippen's contract. I can't wait to see where this thing goes. I think I read or heard Rodman's coming up. His episode's coming up. So that's going to open some eyes, because there's a lot of people right now. If you didn't realize what Pippen was like, you probably had no idea about Rodman.
Yeah, I don't think any of us really know about Rodman. Because like you said, he's the guy you actually heard stories about back in the day when everything was a little more insular with these teams.
Yeah.
And I have a feeling we're just going to hear stories that are going to boggle our mind here in the next couple of weeks. I would assume, like you said, we have the Rodman episode coming up. We probably have an episode, I would assume, about Phil Jackson.
Yep.
And then more about Jordan and just his overall tenacity and competitiveness. I would imagine there's at least one episode on that.
It's got to be. So we'll be doing this after every single episode. 8 more still to come. They're going to be airing every Sunday, back-to-back, 2 episodes every Sunday for 5 straight weeks. So we'll be back again to do this again next week. Had a lot of fun, Mike. This has been a lot of fun to watch, and it's pretty cool to see just about everybody, at least on my timeline on social media, watching this documentary.
Yeah, this is something during this quarantine that's bringing everyone together from a sports perspective, and it felt good again, quote unquote, watching a game with everyone on Twitter last night.
Yeah, exactly. Catch us on YouTube, Twitter, Distant Podcast, our website, distantreplaypodcast.com. You can email us as well, distantpodcast@gmail.com. If you have any thoughts, any games you want to hear us talk about once we return back to talking games, all that and more. We appreciate it. Hit subscribe. Also, when you get a second, leave us a review as well. And we'll talk to you on the next episode of the Distant Replay Podcast.